Do you know the Saxophonetics YouTube channel by Jake Dester? You probably don't know Jake Dester, but you gotta get to know this guy who does a great job when it comes to articulation and phrasing for jazz saxophone. So come and join me for my first episode of Ask Me Now, where sometimes I'm the one who's answering, but today I'm the one who's asking the questions. When we talk about what is articulation, why is it so important, and how and why did Jake from Saxophonetics choose this as his most important topic for his YouTube channel. Thanks for visiting me on this thing here. I really dig your videos about articulation that you put on your Saxophonetics channel.
Thank you.
Do you want to introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure. My name is Jake Dester. I am a saxophonist, composer, producer, performer, teacher, sort of a jack of all trades. And I live in New York City. I've been playing saxophone for over 22 years, and I have a degree in jazz saxophone performance from North Texas, where I studied from 2006 to 2012. Being there for that time, I actually was able to work with Jim Riggs, who was the saxophone chair, the jazz saxophone chair when I got there, and then Brad Lely, who took his place kind of during that phase.
Okay. And how did you get from North Texas to New York? I mean, why this move?
It's a long story, but basically I knew I wanted to live in a city. I had been living in Denton, Texas, which was my college town, trying to keep a band together. People were graduating, people were leaving. There just wasn't enough consistency, and I felt like there wasn't really enough opportunity. I didn't really like driving everywhere. Eventually, I moved to Chicago, and I lived there for a brief period, and then I came to Brooklyn in 2016. My intentions when I came to Brooklyn really were more focused on writing music and writing songs. At that time, I actually wasn't playing the saxophone at all. It just wasn't really a component of my life. And about a year living in Brooklyn, I really wanted to get back into it. I had a lot of things attached to saxophone playing that were really unhealthy. I came back to it in a more organic way. I think it was about a year. No, I was done at that point. I had sold all my instruments. I was like, I'm never going to do this again. There's just so much competition in the jazz saxophone world, and I'm not even sure why I'm doing this. So that's, I think, a very important part of my journey, because my study up to that point, I felt like other people were telling me what to do. I didn't really know what I was doing musically or what I even wanted to do. When I came to New York, I didn't even have a horn. I did the very risky and stereotypical thing of just getting rid of everything I owned and going to the city. Yeah, it's been wild ever since.
The city is a hard place to be. I remember that. I went there 2004 with just a suitcase with all my stuff and a saxophone and a laptop, and that was it. I had friends in New York, like Adam Holtzman. Maybe you know him. When he tours Europe, I'm playing in his band, Brave New World. He was a keyboarder with Miles Davis in the 1980s.
Yeah.
And Andy McKee from the Mingus Big Band, who invited me to play with them a couple of times, but I never showed up. I didn't figure out it was so important at that time. I was kind of naive, I'd say. It's been a long time ago. How old are you now, actually?
Oh, how old am I? I just turned 35.
That's what I guessed, yeah. So it's 10 years younger than I am. You're doing a great job with this articulation thing on your channel, I think. And I especially love that you are focusing so much on it. But I have one question that I'm really interested in. Why, of all things, why is articulation so important?
I think of it like pronunciation. You can know how to pronounce written language in English, right? Let's say you're reading English, you're looking at English language, and then suddenly you're looking at German. You try to pronounce German with an English accent, interpreting all of the different characters to mean what they would mean to you if you're speaking English. And it's not German. It's the same alphabet, but it's not the same pronunciation.
True.
For saxophone, and for what seems like almost all of jazz education, you have book after book after book after book, transcription after transcription. All the notes, all the pitches, and all the rhythms are notated with no guidance whatsoever as for how did this person or how would someone playing in this style actually articulate this line. I learned, at that time, the internet resources were just sort of coming into being. For the most part, I was using transcription books and the Omnibook, especially, to try to learn jazz. The Omnibook is pretty, like, if you look at it, there's maybe half a dozen or so articulations written into the Omnibook. And as a 16, 17-year-old kid interested in learning to play more advanced jazz, I didn't know what to do in terms of articulation. And by the time that I auditioned for school, I had this experience where I played my piece. I played like 2 or 3 tunes for Jim Riggs and Eric Nestler, who's the classical chair there. And, they were like, thank you, whatever. And they were like, do you have any questions for me? And I asked, like, well, do you have any like direct feedback you could share? And Riggs was like, well, saxophone players don't articulate like that. And I was like, oh, what? He's like, yeah, jazz players, they don't articulate like that. And I was like, well, what does he mean by that? Because I've been a jazz player. I've been playing jazz. I had been playing gigs professionally in my hometown in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I was in the all-city jazz band. I was in the all-state jazz band. What does that even mean? Because I am playing jazz. And really, it took me a long time to figure out what's actually happening in the embouchure and the tongue and the breath and everything. This has been something that I've really had a passion for comprehending and understanding basically since that point. That was like in 2006. Throughout my time at UNT and throughout my life studying, very few teachers that I've worked with have been able to explain what's going on. I got to a point where I was really trying to just dig into Bird's solo on Just Friends, and I wanted to get every articulation.
This opening
I just
line
got
is just incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just got into like I had a little, staff paper book, and I would write out every phrase. And then I would slow it down. I used transcribe and slow it down to like whatever I would need to slow it down to get an approximation of like when is his tongue on the reed or off the reed. And the way that I notate that is with parentheses and basically the most basic combination of markings that I can think of. And that actually was inspired by a Cannonball Adderley transcription book that's I think it's just called the Cannonball Adderley Collection. But that was transcribed by a cat named Tim Price. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure if he's still around, actually. But that book, every single articulation was notated. All the ghost notes were all put in parentheses. And I remember seeing that as a kid and being like, I don't know what the heck that means. I also had a Coltrane transcription book where all the note heads were X note heads. And I was like, I can't even read this. So those kinds of resources were like perplexing to me. I would just think like, okay, so what does that mean? What am I supposed to do? The more that I kind of shopped around for different teachers and like I was assigned to different instructors in college and started teaching people myself, I was like starting to think of it more phonetically, which is the namesake for Saxophonetics. And at first I was thinking doodle, like doodle tongue. People talk about doodle tonguing. People talk about duden tonguing.
Indian.
But if you, and what?
Indian. That's what you said.
Indian. Yeah, that's what I came to, because I was looking far and wide to kind of gather information for this method that I'm working on. A student of mine was like, well, you should check out Joe Allard stuff, like whatever you can find of Joe Allard speaking on articulation. That school, Joe Allard was one of the great classical saxophone players or saxophone players, period. Taught at New England Conservatory and taught lessons to a bunch of great people, including Michael Brecker.
Liebman.
Liebman, yeah. The list is very long of students whose impact he's had on, and
one of the first big saxophone teachers, right, in the U.S.
Yeah.
Do you know Sigurd Russia? His right off the book, top tones for the saxophone.
Yeah, I used to practice out of that thing like religiously.
Yeah.
But yeah, once I started understanding like Allard's approach, where he's talking about like having like a he sort of tongue shape, and the sides of the tongue are basically touching the inside edges of the molars, and I was like, well, how can you play saxophone at this, the advanced level of like the classical cats, like from Marcel Mule on down the line, if you're thinking do, because and I studied like images, like what's happening in the throat when you say different vowel sounds and what's happening with the tongue and how do these things affect your range of motion if you're playing the saxophone. And essentially what I've settled on, reading, watching videos, talking to other people, talking to a bunch of different saxophone teachers, is like, you essentially have an E tongue shape as your foundation. And that gives you a great starting point. This ooh and ah and wherever that is, you're kind of changing the voicing. An E is a very neutral position. It also leaves the tip of the tongue in a really good spot to just attack the reed, or in the case of ghosting, you're just going from and it's much easier. It's much easier than thinking doodle 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 doodle.
Definitely, yeah.
Because when you make that L sound, phonetically, that's called a dark L. And the dark L, you actually have to change the shape of the back of your tongue. So you're drawing the tongue back, and the tip of the tongue becomes more distant. So then when you go to attack the reed, you have to kind of make this motion. But if you're going dee nee 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 nee, it just stays right here. Or doodle 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 is like your whole tongue is moving.
And especially when you change the back of your throat, also your sound is changing. And it's also, when it comes to, the sound is not consistent then anymore. That's also not a good thing, especially when, the same amount of air can't flow through your mouthpiece and stuff like that. It doesn't work as fluently as it should anymore.
Absolutely. And part of that is, it's kind of the key to, if you're trying to learn these rapid fire, like Charlie Parker lines or Sonny Stitt lines, or whoever you're getting into. Stan Getz, Sonny Rollins is incredible with his articulation. If you can keep the range of motion as slight as possible, like just, we're talking about like millimeters distance and sometimes your tongue is literally on the reed, so there's no distance whatsoever. It allows you to play those techniques without a lot of frustration. And I didn't know any of this when I was learning to play jazz. I feel like in this period of my life, I'm sort of having this new appreciation for saxophone playing and this like new love of studying saxophone, especially jazz saxophone, because the world of articulation is like, it hasn't really been documented much. It hasn't really been explored that much. Young players especially are just commenting on my videos and my TikTok, and band directors are giving me positive feedback. Like, this is going to help my kids so much. I'm like, that's exactly what I hoped it would do. I was hoping that I would be able to communicate to people that are starting out, or even advanced players, things that I wish I knew, resources that I wish I had. So I'm kind of doing this for myself. Now it's at the point where I want to share it with other people because I've benefited from developing this concept so much.
It's always great fun if we can learn with you. Watching your videos, I noticed that you just checked it out for yourself, and now you're just telling everybody else, hey, just look what I found, and how it is easily explained. And it's just fun to learn it with you, alongside with you. Yeah, you're just 1 or 2 steps ahead like this, It feels like it. Of course, you are a lot more ahead than any beginner watching your videos, as I'm sure. You are going in depth of the work. You're not doing everything like this and that and bunch of issues, but you are talking about the phonetics of the saxophone. And that's just something that the world has waited for, I'm sure. I mean, really.
Thank you. One of the videos I put out, it was just like surprising. It's just called Articulation is like really important in jazz.
Yeah, it's a great title.
That video just took off. I think it has almost 40,000 plays, and I put it out like maybe 6 weeks ago. Mm-hmm. I think that one's really good because I'm using a line, like I'm using a 2/5 line, and it's like, okay, well, people already, they kind of know about 2/5s and all that. I do want to keep it pretty tight to articulation, or at least like remain very focused on articulation. But there's so much of jazz vocabulary where people will talk about the pitches and the rhythms. So I could make a video on the exact same 2/5 that someone else is talking about and come at it from the angle of articulation and get the same result with maybe a different point of reference.
Definitely. And you are going to be the expert for that soon. I mean, you already are, in my opinion.
Appreciate that.
Like, I mean, on the internet, if you watch the internet, you are the expert about that. But you haven't answered my first question yet correctly.
Oh, sure.
Just in a couple of words, why is articulation so important?
It's like style. It's tailoring the presentation of the line to the line itself.
I would say, I don't know if you agree, but it's sharpening the image that you want to create. It's talking about having the possibility to putting out a more definite and more stronger statement of what you are about to say, of what you want to say. Because when I'm using the right or some articulation that I thought of, it's obvious that this is on purpose. And when I can show that what I'm playing is on purpose and not just something that just came up or I just came up with or something that's under my fingers, but I play this on purpose. I want this to sound like that. Then it becomes a strong statement that everybody can buy. You can say, okay, I hear you, you know. And if you just doodle around and play some lousy notes, you know, it's just not as easy to understand and to get a grip on. That's what I think. Would you agree?
I do agree, and I appreciate your perspective on it like that. I thought of a couple things. One is that my first instrument really was singing. My church community basically recognized I could sing, so they would just throw me into whatever musical or whatever the church was putting on.
Same with
and I've been pretty consistent songwriter since I was a kid too.
Cool.
And I love songs. I love singing along to songs. I love learning the lyrics and all that. And there was a period where I was trying to learn songs. Like I was studying pop singers. And part of this was financial because I was trying to make my living playing in the subway. So I needed to know, how do I sing like Bruno Mars? Or how do I sing like CeeLo Green? Or how do I sing like Bill Withers? And those kinds of, like, you know, when you hear Bill Withers, it's Bill Withers.
Yeah.
Look, someone else could sing the same song with the exact same pitches and rhythms, but the way that he affects the words. Saxophone is this really, it's a paradoxical thing because you can express whatever you want, but you can't literally say anything. So the addition of phonetics, the addition of articulation and like very specific shaping the articulation to the line gives it an even more vocal quality.
Yeah, that's true, yeah.
The other thought I had was jazz really in its the meaning of the word, it's more like emphasis. It's like you've taken these stock standards that everybody's mom had in their piano bench, and then when radio came out, you had people like Joe Stafford doing very basic renditions of these things that were just very widespread appeal. And then you had black musicians who were basically disenfranchised from playing in the orchestras and the, you know, what we would now call like the legit field, are just as talented, if not more talented than their classical white contemporaries, are now taking these tunes, because these are basically the vehicles that are available for expression, and emphasizing them in new ways, taking the limitation of, you know, basically you get to play I Got Rhythm and you get to play Pennies from Heaven and blah, 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 blah. But, you know, that's been done before. And people were then, black musicians specifically, were then essentially forced to innovate and create art out of what is like initially pretty plain and boring music by adding emphasis, which was then, you know, it's like a slang term for emphasis or a slang term for like enthusiasm. It's like they put jazz on it. It became jazz music. And that coming from blues, especially blues singing and blues guitar playing. I've thought about this a lot, you know, like this is a very rich tradition that goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. And it's all how you sing, how you represent your unique perspective. But it's also, and in my opinion, I agree with Charlie Parker, he said something like he wanted to create music that was beautiful, that was easily understood. Articulation makes the music more easily understood and arguably more beautiful when you can sort of display different facets of the line and depict your lines and depict your phrases in a way that is authentic and a way that is like you said, like intentional. Like it's not just chance. I happen to be articulating and I happen to be fingering these notes And that's what came out. It's like, I intended to state this melody in this very specific way.
Yeah, and this intention makes it so strong. Did you figure out, okay, he wanted it to be that way, and he wanted to say that, what he just said. That makes it stronger. I mean, a friend of mine just gave the depiction of if I'm smoking a cigarette and I'm throwing it on the floor, this is not it's not a piece of art, you know. But if I'm smoking a cigarette and throwing it on the floor, and then I'm taking a frame and I'm putting it on the wall, and maybe I entitle this the cigarette or whatever, you know, and this is shown in MoMA or in Guggenheim Museum. It's a very special exhibition. Then it becomes art just because of the frame and because of the environment that I'm putting this into. And so, that same thing could be said about every phrase that you play, or about everything that you put out. I mean, actually every piece of art that you put out. If you have the right frame for it, it's believable. It's something that people can hold on to, you know. That's what I think. So this is why articulation is so important. Okay. You mentioned that you studied the Omni book and you studied the Cannonball Adderley book by Tim Price. What other books would you recommend? There are some books out that have articulation as their main issue. For example, this Lenny Niehaus thing that I made a little series of videos on. I mean, they only have 3 different articulation marks put in there. But then there's this Jim Snyder book. Maybe you know this one, Easy Jazz Conception by Jim Snyder. And Bob Mintzer has also put out some jazz etudes, that's how he called it, where you also can see articulation marks put in, and he obviously tried to emphasize on this topic. Would you recommend working with these books, especially for beginners? And what books have you checked out, or have you practiced or taught with some of those books? Do you know them at all?
Personally, I'm familiar with the Niehaus book a little bit. And I hope I'm saying his Lenny Niehaus, is that how you say it?
I think so. He's from the West Coast.
He talks about like the taut, like different phonetic pronunciations for certain articulations, right?
He has dat, ta, and da.
Dot, ta, and da.
You know, like da, 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 ta, you know, like this.
Mm-hmm. So I'm not super familiar with that book, but I appreciate you bringing it to my attention. Something I now feel like I have to check out. I did have a Bob Mintzer book that I studied out of for a while that was like Jazz and Funk Etudes, I think is what it was called.
I know the one. It's a more ambitious one, I'd say, for the advanced player. He also has easier books for students, you know, that are more earlier level, I'd say.
I try not to recommend books so much. My advice is always to assign some kind of transcription, some sort of solo transcription that I feel suits their taste, that suits their skill level, to have them be really attentive to articulation. What I hope, and I have studied a lot of different transcription books and technical books. The Omni book was like a big one for me. The Cannonball Adderley collection was a big one for me. John Coltrane, the John Coltrane transcription book. It's like has like a blue and orange cover. Mm-hmm. I spent a lot of time with that one.
Do you also play the tenor at all?
I have historically, but since I moved to New York, the only saxophone that I've played is an alto sax. Mm-hmm. And it's a funny story behind the horn I play. Maybe we'll come to that later.
Yeah, hopefully.
But yeah, at a certain point, it was just like, what I know I need to do is to just use my ear and listen to these records using, you know, really, really sensitive awareness for articulation and also practicing articulation techniques. What I hope is part of the result of the Saxophonetics channel and all of this, the blog and the email list and everything, is that I start to produce books and video resources that people can have that I wish I had had when I was 12, 13, 14 years old, starting to learn the saxophone. And then come to find after I auditioned for college that I knew nothing about this intentional ghost note articulation, accents, you know, tonguing the upbeats, all the essential style elements. I don't know. I recommend, if you're watching this in 6 months, maybe I recommend the book that I have.
Mm-hmm. Hopefully. We're looking out for that.
But as far as books, I think a really good practice would probably be if you're still struggling with transcribing pitches and rhythms, get a really clear transcription book or get an etude book that has a recording of the artist or the educator who wrote the book, and go in with a pencil, or if you're on a tablet, whatever, notate the thing so that what you're hearing and what you're seeing, you have an understanding of all the different like pronunciations, so to speak. Which notes are ghosted, which notes are accented, which notes are slurred. Are there dynamic changes? I went through a period where I was transcribing Johnny Hodges solos by hand. And I was writing in like crescendos and decrescendos and the vibrato and closeness of the waves as the note kind of tapers off and things like that. And
cool.
Big bends. I hit like like that kind of stuff. And that's super fun to visualize. I'm a very visual person, and obviously I'm very musical, but I'm a strong believer that you can make as many connections as you want, and the more connections that you make, the more you reinforce your learning. I'm not a purist when it comes to you should learn everything by ear because you play music with your ears. It's true. You are listening, but the visual component of our brains is the dominant force. So if you can reinforce that through visual learning, if you can reinforce that through singing, I love to like figure out like the solfeggio of whatever line I'm learning, whatever resources you have, dig into them. I just wish that there were more resources on articulation. That's what I'm hoping to create. And that's what I've done so far with this. Honestly, I mean, Charlie Parker is always going to be like my foundation. I basically insist, use Transcribe or use the Amazing Slowdowner or some software like this and slow it down. And sometimes I just have a practice of like, I'll throw on, some record, but I'll put it at 50% and just listen to the track at half tempo. Because you start to notice more things. Obviously, you get too slow and there's like digital artifacts that kind of affect the sound. But
in earlier days, they used different things to slow down the listening experience, more like biological things.
What do you mean?
They smoked weed,
That's it for now. I hope there was something in for you in this little conversation we had earlier this year when I still had my old practice room and recorded this interview. Stay tuned for more. There's a second section when we also play our instruments for each other. Hope to see you soon for the second part.